If I use my platform to rail against transgenders and people with disabilities, guess what? You can take to social media and call me a dumb witch that should be fired from my job, or better yet, die from some terrible, unidentifiable disease. The later is what some call cancel culture. Others call it consequence culture and applaud it as a means for minorities, women, and the powerless to hold celebrities, elected officials, influencers, and anyone with a platform accountable. Today I'm asking, which is it? And is it time to cancel cancel culture? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Cancel culture or call out culture is when someone is called out, typically on social media, for harassing and offensive conduct or comments. Some say that cancel culture, or consequence culture as some like to call it, is a welcome corrective to decades of a singular perspective, usually that of mostly the white male power structure. Others, including big celebrities like Kevin Hart, say this is mob mentality. That is the ultimate form of bullying and an unacceptable abridgment of the First Amendment right to free speech and open debate. Kevin Hart. Okay. Lots to discuss this morning about this thing called cancel culture. My first guest is an author, comedian, and political satirist, Andrew Heaton. He is the host of the Political Orphanage podcast, and he is a returning guest to the Special Report. Good morning, Andrew, and welcome back.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I noticed you are in new surroundings. Congratulations. Looks like you're no
Thank you.
longer in your RV, but you're in some beautiful studio now. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. Last time we spoke, I was living out of a 13-foot fiberglass camper. I have now upgraded to a one-bedroom apartment, so I'm doing quite well.
Well, okay. Glad you are on dry land and stable so we can have this conversation. And when I thought about talking about cancel culture, of course, have to talk to someone like yourself who's both a comedian and a political commentator, because you are like at the intersection of so many of these conversations that are taking place. I was also looking at a podcast, or I guess it was a summary of a podcast where Cat Williams, the uber successful comedian, he was on with Joe Budden on that podcast a couple of weeks ago. It went viral after he said there is no such thing as cancel culture. And that what's happening is people of color are finally getting a chance to speak up against people who have been marginalized by those with more money and bigger platforms. What do you think about what Kat had to say about cancel culture?
I think there's two things going on here. You mentioned in your opening monologue that there's consequence culture, and then there's the other concept that we're talking about of cancel culture. And I think a lot of the time that we're actually discussing different things. The idea that if I say something hateful, that's just getting laughs by virtue of being a bully, and that's going to have consequences, I think is a good thing, that there's going to be consequences to that. If it's just me, getting paid for clapping from bigots or something like that. The thing that I typically fear is I think that we have a culture right now that almost has like a 2 minutes hate kind of thing going on from Orwell, where it's almost like we're just kind of bored and we want to throw somebody into a volcano. And sometimes that's like conservatives going off of never Trumpers. Sometimes that's leftists going off of people that aren't woke. But the thing that worries me is kind of arbitrary getting thrown into a volcano. The thing that doesn't worry me is getting in trouble for things that I say and I back up.
Yeah, but what do you think about, comics? And it's not just Kevin Hart, so I don't want to make this about Kevin Hart, but we've had, folks like Dave Chappelle, some of these biggest, comics in the business who have said that, cancel culture is just gone too far, and that it is preventing them from even, doing their art, doing what they get paid to do, that they're afraid to take risks, that they're afraid to talk about things that traditionally have not been off limits. Do you think they have a point?
Yeah, I kind of lean that direction. I think that for comedy to work really well, it needs to entail the ability to have risks. You need to be able to say things that are potentially provocative and funny. Again, the goal is always to be funny. If I am afraid of saying things that might get me in trouble with whatever my team is, then I'm not going to do more daring comedy like Richard Pryor or Lenny Bruce or anything like that. And as a result, it's going to be more tame and more tepid. And so I think that there's something to that. You want to have a looseness. You need to have a certain ability to go out and do that. And I think right now we're trying to figure out what those restraints are of being able to express like, hey, this is actually deeply offensive, without it just turning into an electric fence that's everywhere. But I think that they've got a very good point about that we do need to have the ability to go into things that are kind of murky and not worry that we're going to be ruined by doing so.
But what about, Dave Chappelle? He did a Netflix comedy where he was, taking up for Louis C.K. and others. He made some pretty disparaging remarks about the folks who accused Michael Jackson of sexual assault. Are comics in a different class? Should they be given, special privileges that other folks who have big platforms aren't given?
I would love as a comedian to have all sorts of privileges available to me that nobody else has. That sounds terrific. But I think generally in terms of a structure of how we deal with this, I don't think that it's that you should be completely shielded from consequence. And like just a really good example of that is there is kind of a market mechanism that happens. Like let's say that I'm just not that funny. It would be very odd of me to claim that I should be able to maintain my audience if I cease being funny, right? So if my audience doesn't find me funny because I'm saying offensive things, of course that should be some sort of consequence to that. I think that when it comes to things like Louis C.K. and guys like that, it's not that they should be able to operate with impunity. I think that it's a better idea that we just come up with what is the system that we really want to have in place for dealing with these kind of things. So is Louis C.K. done forever? Like if somebody does something, are they permanently banned? Do they go through some sort of rehabilitative process? It's the arbitrary nature of it that freaks me out. Not that there are consequences, but that I don't know the scope that they're going to have, and I don't know quite what the rules are. That's the thing that scares me.
Yeah, it's funny because Cat Williams said pretty much just, I think what you said, which is that comics who aren't funny maybe should find other jobs.
Uh-huh. That's why I got into politics. I'm only kind of funny. If I were super funny, I'd be a full-time comedian. As it is, I'm a very clever commentator.
And Cat says nothing really has been taken away from comics, that they can still, I can't even say what Cat said because, it's all kinds of expletives and profanity that I won't use because this is a morning show. But, he says, look, you can go out and say those things and just be prepared to live with what comes as a result. If your audience finds it funny, then, you're okay. And if the audience doesn't find it funny, that's the consequence of not being funny. So I think there's something to what Kat is saying. Are people overreacting? I mean, if a child does something wrong, there are consequences associated with that. Mm-hmm. So why shouldn't you, as an adult and a comic or whatever, an artist, be expected to be held accountable if you make jokes that people find offensive?
Good points, all. And I think if you're making jokes that are offensive and not funny, and people don't find them funny, that is something that would definitely negatively impact your career and should, just like any other product. I think that what's different now than in previous times is when you go back to other periods where we felt that there was some sort of censorship happening, it tended to be an external censorship, like with George Carlin or Lenny Bruce or something like that. It was the government coming in and saying you could or could not say a given thing and you'd get in trouble, but there wasn't any type of in-group restraint that was happening. Now, because a lot of the time it's in-group restraint, it means people are going to be a little bit more careful to go out and just consider things. Like I think Bill Burr is a very funny comedian. In his first album, he talks about how who should buy dinner on dates, and I don't think we've quite figured that out yet. Most of the women I know that I date make more money than me, so it's like I'm willing to have this conversation, and it does get into some murky water, but it's worth kind of doing that because I think comedy, by virtue of pulling those layers back and going, we haven't quite figured this out yet, can be a good positive source for sorting out a lot of the ambiguity we have in culture. But we have to be empowered to do that if we can have those conversations. The other thing that I'd mentioned that I think is a relevant factor is that a lot of the time when it comes to cancel culture, we end up thinking of it as a kind of proxy between progressives and conservatives, and it becomes a left-right thing. I actually think that's a very bad way to look at it. I think that the clashes we tend to have in culture tend to be between pluralists and authoritarians. And pluralism is the idea that you have the right to be wrong. That, if I'm an atheist and you're a Baptist or whatever, we can both agree that we're going to be able to live in the public sphere and we're not going to get run out, right? And then authoritarians tend to want compliance and they want everybody to be on the same page. And I find that tends to be the real bright line in a lot of these debates is more of, do we all have to be on the same page or do we have the capacity to be wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what about folks like Chrissy Teigen? She's gotten a lot of heat lately because of alleged online bullying. I guess it's not even alleged because she acknowledged it herself. She's issued an apology for, what she calls hateful things that
Mhm.
she said. And someone like her, where do we draw the line with someone like Chrissy, who has been outspoken on so many issues that people care about? She's been incredibly supportive of a lot of causes that people think are
Mhm.
really good, but yet she engaged in this conduct that she herself admits to that was really kind of just downright nasty.
Could well be. I'm unfamiliar with the instances that you're referring to with her, so I don't know the specific story. But the things that I would be very curious to find out about it before I weighed in on what we should do with her are, first of all, how heinous were the acts that she committed? It sounds like they were very bad, based on what you're saying. She was just outright bullying people and saying intolerant things. I'd also want to know how far in the past they were. I'd want to know if she had made steps to correct herself and to expand and grow as a person. One of the weird things right now that I think makes Twitter so relevant to all of this is that Twitter forces us to live in a constant now where, like, I'm an independent now. I've been a Democrat. I've been a Republican. So there are positions that I've held that I don't agree with anymore and that I have grown from. And I can't recall any like horrible things that are going to pop out and ruin my career, or just, heinous things that I thought, but things that I definitely think were categorically incorrect or not productive in the past. Right. But I've changed on that. And it would be very weird for me to have to fight kind of like a vanguard movement from behind, calling me out for stuff I believed when I was in high school. So I don't know if it's something where she said something heinous and then got caught and had crocodile tears. That's one thing. If she said something when she was like 19, or it was 2 years ago, there might still need to be consequences to it. But my main thing is I just want there to be a kind of a codified system that we can all operate with, that we know is going to be more or less applied the same, and that you can kind of navigate. That's the thing. Again, it's the kind of arbitrary ambiguity that really freaks me out. And I think that's why people like Kevin Hart reference mobs, because there's a kind of sense of big unwielding anger happening that we don't know what's going to occur.
Yeah, but on the other side of that, don't you think it's really a good thing that everyday people who ordinarily would not have a voice, would not have a platform, can take to social media, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or any of these platforms, and really cause there to be real substantive change? You look at Ellen DeGeneres. So
Hmm.
we know Ellen, has this super successful daytime talk show, 18 years. She now says, she's done, she's over. But a lot of that, we started to learn about this really toxic work culture, not because the big executives at the network decided to share that information, but because staff members, people that worked in that toxic work culture, started talking about it. And we've seen that Refinery 29 and so many other, media giants that have come under attack lately because some lowly worker who's been, oppressed in that environment decided that, they weren't getting results from HR, they weren't getting results from their bosses, so they take to social media, and then all of a sudden, people who've been in that same environment say, "Oh, that my God, that happened to me too."
Hmm.
And now it's exposed, and it's
Mm-hmm.
stuff that should have been exposed. It's in many instances really horrific conduct.
Yeah, you make a great point, and I think Me Too's a wonderful example of that. Of there were all of these instances of horrible things happening that had been repressed and had not been reported, and the powers that be had suffocated them so that no one ever saw how bad the situation was in aggregate, or at least the country as a whole was not aware of it. And it's very good that we have that capacity. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's good that the old power structures are collapsing and that there's been a democratization of the ability to express what's personally happened to us and our problems with it. I'm very much on board with that. The only concern that I would put in there is not so much that as I think that social media can kind of exacerbate problems in the same way that I don't want to have a fight with my girlfriend via text or get into an argument with my friends on Facebook, just because I think that the barrier to entry is very low in terms of the effort required. Like if you got really mad at me 20 years ago and you wanted to kick me off a show, you'd have to get a phone book, find the address for the company, write a letter. Like, you would be really mad, right? Whereas now you can like have a fake handle on Twitter. You can be sitting on your toilet. You can be kind of bored and go, yeah, I hate that guy. Click. And so there is a the lack, social media in general, I think having a lack of nuance to it and an inability to communicate the emotional timbre and emotional context of what's happening can skew situations very quickly in bad directions. But the overall premise that, yeah, it should be great for just regular people like me that are not a part of an institution and the many, many other people that are in that camp to be able to express their discontent. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I want to bring you into the conversation now, and broaden this conversation. We've been talking about comics, we've been talking about artists, we'll talk about elected officials. We see they too have had a lot to say about cancel culture, and whether it's a real thing, whether it's a talking point for conservatives. And Rachel Bitecofer is an election forecaster and political analyst, and she's the founder of The Cycle, a digital platform for news and politics. And she herself says she's been canceled multiple times by the right. Good morning and welcome, Rachel, to the conversation.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about folks being canceled, and is it the right thing? Is cancel culture gone too far? Tell us. You told me before we came on air that you've been canceled. What happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what I would reiterate is that this idea, this entire concept of canceling stuff, really has its roots on the political right, and we never talk about it, right? The right understands that about us strategically. By the way, they know that they can serve something up like cancel culture or critical race theory, and they'll attack us, and then we will have these really deep, well-meaning dissections and conversations about the topic they want us to talk about, and not on the terms that would benefit us politically, right? So what I would say is, the right started off by canceling Disney movies because there was a gay couple, or they thought one of the animated characters was a little too gay or something like that. They've canceled university professors. It created an entire organization that basically asked students to tape record their professors and turn them in for being too liberal in the classroom. Now they're canceling democracy, right? Or they tried to cancel an entire presidential election, right? So I'm happy always to talk about cancel culture and to remind people that it's easy to find a couple of excesses. Alexi McCannon recently lost her position at Teen Vogue over something she tweeted when she was a teenager. Was it insensitive? Yes, but Zoomers, those who are in their early 20s and younger, should know that those of us that are older grew up in a very different America, and it's one that has made a lot of progress in terms of treatment of others, language, especially rhetoric. But in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, the culture was very, very different. So you could go back to almost anybody's record and find things, as Andrew was talking about, to dissect. And what matters now is people's contemporaneous behavior, right? So, to me, it's easy to look at these excesses like Alexi McCannon and say, this thing is run amok. But in general, when somebody is losing their job, it is because they've done something contemporaneously that isn't conducive to the company that employs them's bottom line. And that is a corporate free market decision being made by employers who have a bottom line that they have to serve. And if they have an employee who has, caused some kind of crisis with racially coded language or sexist language, or, some kind of thing with their past, then that is, their prerogative. The First Amendment covers speech and interference from the government, not from private corporations. So we do see a lot of latitude there. And as a result, you see people like me get canceled from Republicans putting pressure on institutions. And you see people like, coming from the left that are pressured by corporations. And I do want to just make one more point. Like, it's also about enabling, right? So we wouldn't have excesses of cancel culture if we didn't have these company heads, studio heads, media, and other private employers overreacting to social media. I just cannot reiterate enough how unreflective political Twitter is. I mean, it's not even a big part of Twitter, and Twitter itself only represents maybe tops 5% of the entire public. So we tend to think these things are a lot bigger than they are. And, the success of Coke after the Georgia voting law probably tells us that maybe it's not, the social media outcry is maybe not enough to move a company's bottom line. And maybe that would give them more latitude to be corrective and not maybe draconian in enforcement of things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rachel, that you say that the political right is the cause of cancel culture, because we know right before there was a vote by Republicans to oust Liz Cheney from her leadership role in the party, members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, took to the floor for hours to rail against cancel culture, as they call it, calling it a dangerous phenomenon used by progressives to censor and silence Americans. So you kind of have this tug of war going on where Republicans are blaming liberals, saying liberals are using cancel culture to silence Americans. And you just said that, the cancel culture emanates from the Republican Party. So, folks, I kind of leave you scratching your head, like, who's right? Where is this coming from? Because we've seen both parties, and basically it's not even as much cancel culture as it is, I don't like you, so let me figure out a way to, disrupt what you're doing and to marginalize or minimize you. So is it even the right frame to think about it in terms of the right or the left?
I don't think it is. To reiterate, I think that the fight has long been between authoritarians and between pluralists. Pluralists being people that can be all right with wrong opinions. Authoritarians being people who can't. And Rachel absolutely brought up, like in the 90s, the cultural censorship mechanisms, the cultural ones, not the government, although they were doing that too, were coming from the right, because it was the angry people that were mad that, like, Bart Simpson said "but," or that they're like that Murphy Brown was a single woman that had a baby and that kind of thing. And now we see a lot of that culturally coming from the left. And I don't think, for me, I don't see so much it being an element of emanating from a particular party so much as that illiberal instinct of either you view bad opinions as something that is a pathogen that must be destroyed, or you view bad opinions as something that can be brought to light through greater scrutiny. And that's the traditional liberal way of dealing with things, is more dialogue, more rationalism. The traditional authoritarian way of dealing with things is to squelch stuff we don't want for fear that it will spread. And I think illiberal versus liberal might be a better way of describing this phenomenon than right versus left.
Can I just add to that real quick? So, also here, as I was alluding to, so, the Republican Party is weaponizing things like cancel culture, right? I mean, it's not like an accident. It's an intentional strategy that they deploy to win campaigns by winning branding and messaging. So, but the problem is that, like, we are so sincere on the left that we want to have this conversation, and we want it to be introspective and think about ourselves, right? So, it is true, and Andrew's absolutely right. It is about liberalism and tolerance towards pluralism that defines somebody's tolerance to hear things that they don't like, right? But at the same time, what's happening, the reason we're talking about cancel culture right now, and we're talking about it from this frame, that it's a huge problem on the left, and we're not even talking about the fact that it's a massive problem right now on the right, where they're canceling trans students in Arkansas with legislation, elections with legislation. We're basically doing their bidding, and they just know how we operate, so we knew we would.
Is Rachel, let me ask you, is cancel culture at play with the recall efforts we're seeing in California? There's like recall fever. I live in California, and from Governor Gavin Newsom to the district attorney in Los Angeles, the district attorney in San Francisco, city council members in Los Angeles, and now even the sheriff of Los Angeles are all facing recall efforts. The vote for Governor Gavin Newsom's recall is happening like within months. Is that the right, is that their version of cancel culture?
I mean, it's one mechanism and tool of them. So, with the California recall is a completely strategic initiative. You only need Republicans and right-leaning independents to support one of these petitions for recall. Something that California really, it's an era, it's an, something, an artifact of eras past to have such a low bar for recall. Recall should be done for misconduct, right, or corruption or something like that, not because you don't like the guy. And but they're banking on this, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to see this manifest as the recall moves towards its eventual election day. Is they're banking on, okay, they can have this partisan recall that's done with the hope that low turnout will allow them to thread the needle and win back California, even though they're a distinct minority of California's population. but they're banking on the left to have a actual like meritorious conversation about whether Gavin Newsom should be recalled. The man that led the state. I mean, California's economic growth is better than any state in the nation right now. And they basically eliminated all of COVID almost in California, right? So, they're counting on us, again, to have these sincere, retrospective, introspective pursuits. And, it is kind of like taking candy from a baby, because I guarantee you there will be a movement on the far left anyway that's dissatisfied with Newsom that will play into their hands.
And Andrew, it's kind of ironic that Republicans, who are the biggest critics of cancel culture, are the ones who are promoting like the recall of Governor Newsom and some of these other elected officials. And essentially when they lose, like they lost the election, the presidential election, then they rail against it and essentially in the same cancel culture fashion that they, are accusing the Democrats of.
And using the power of government to do it. Okay, like that's the thing, right? So we have to really make that distinction. The Republican Party, by trying to cancel the 2020 election, they're still trying to cancel it. They have the fraud in Arizona. They have multiple, approaches to other fraudits everywhere across the country. And they know that there's no malfeasance. We all know because these ballots have been counted 6-7 times, right? So we actually have the most secure election in American history in 2020, and we know there was no fraud because it's been so closely forensic. But they're doing all of that and counting on the fact that we'll talk about the audit instead. We'll call it an audit. We'll legitimize it, and that they can get away with that without it being tied back to it's a massive overplay by government power when you're passing legislation that changes the voting system in a way that's anti-democratic. When you're using the state legislature is the one that prompted this fraud in Arizona, they're using the power of government to cancel stuff. And that is very, very, I think, very scary.
Yeah, I want to bring Professor Daniel Kovalik into the conversation. He's a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and he's the author of multiple books, including one called Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, Daniel, you've been listening to this conversation, and you make the point in your book that cancel culture is bad for progressives. Tell us why.
Well, I think it can be bad when it is essentially a form of cannibalizing the left. When leftists and progressives turn on each other, on individuals, because of many times a small perceived infraction. In the book, I give this example that inspired me to write the book. It happened in Pittsburgh. An 85-year-old peace activist who's been a peace activist for over 50 years, who helped found the Thomas Merton Center of Pittsburgh, one of the oldest peace and justice groups in America. She was canceled last summer because she posted a meme that was critical of the violence, some of the violence that was happening around the George Floyd protests. And the specific meme had a picture of Martin Luther King, and it said, "Never looted, never rioted, change the world." And I would, people certainly found it, maybe it was insensitive to post that there, at that moment. In any case, people attacked her viciously on Facebook. She ended up taking it down after these attacks. She did apologize, but that was not enough. And that's another problem with the cancel culture. Apologies tend to actually make things worse. They're largely never accepted. And the Thomas Merton Center, which she helped found 50 years before, sent a letter out, posted it on Facebook, sent it to all the members, said they could no longer associate with her because of a racist meme. They didn't say what it was. So if you weren't familiar with what happened, you couldn't assess whether it was racist or not. And they said, and also because she didn't apologize, when in fact she did, but they didn't think it was a fulsome enough apology. Something happened a similar thing. A guy named David Shore was fired from his job because he tweeted out a study that was actually done by a person of color from Harvard that showed that nonviolent protests are more effective at winning people over than violent protests, which, is not shocking. And he was fired after people attacked him on Twitter. The point is, when you go after people for raising important issues, and I think that was an important issue, what tactics are going to be used in protesting, right? Are we going to turn to violence or not? And by the way, most of the violence was being done by young white male protesters and also young white male right-wingers who were trying to undermine the movement. So I didn't see what she was saying is directed at, people of color. In any case, I think that...
Let me stop you for a second, Daniel, and ask you, okay, so you're talking about overcorrection, right? So I don't know. I just feel like I hear what all of you are saying, but I still feel like we are in a moment in time where people, everyday people who ordinarily have no voice in this country, have no opportunity to enter the public square in any meaningful way and have their voices heard, for the first time now have an opportunity to do so. Yes, it sounds like from that story you just gave, we don't know all the facts. Maybe it was an overcorrection for the 84-year-old to be quote unquote canceled. Maybe the person that lost their job for tweeting the Harvard study shouldn't have lost their job. And, I'm sorry. But we can't lose sight of all the folks who have been quote unquote canceled that need to be canceled. Let's start with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Here's a woman that compares, the Holocaust to COVID restrictions that are saving the lives of millions and millions of people. Are we going to make some argument that Marjorie should not have been taken to task?
She wasn't canceled, right? I mean, we wish we could cancel Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? Because the right does not eat their own anymore. They are in a battle.
Well, right? Rachel, they ate Liz Cheney.
Well, yes. I mean, they only eat the people who are still sane and not interested in pushing the party deeper and towards like a neo-fascist, illustration of its old former glory, right? So, but yeah, let's think about what Liz Cheney got canceled for. She got canceled because she refuses to pretend that the presidential election was stolen and fraudulent, right? We have an entire political party that has convinced its entire voting electorate and its independent leaning coalition that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, even though that, as I've said, is the most scrutinized election in the history of the republic, right? And all of that scrutiny produced zero voter fraud, including in Texas, where there was a $10 million bounty to produce voter fraud, right? So,
hey, Areva, I think you made a great point a moment ago, and I don't want to lose sight of it. The idea that we are living in a period where the everyday person can now participate in national conversation, which is great. I'm a podcaster. I do that in my bedroom. I'm one of these people. It's really nice that I did not have to go through a network in order to participate in all of these conversations. I think that the issue for me, and I think for a lot of people that are worried about cancel culture, is not that there's consequences to actions or that there is a bottom-up response to power structures. All of that's good. It's more like my dad's a federal judge, so I grew up with all these federal judges. And while I'm clearly not an attorney and have no legal experience whatsoever, I do have a kind of intuitive sense of due process and appropriate sentencing structure. And there doesn't seem to be any actual codified mechanism in place when we're dealing with people on Twitter for that as Dan alluded to, what was the thing that happened, what specifically happened, just kind of foregone conclusions of guilt and dispensing with the idea of innocent until proven guilty, and so on and so forth. That all kind of deeply rubs me the wrong way from a kind of jurisprudential sense, not in the sense that there are consequences again, but just that there's not a system in place that is going to be fairly distributed.
Yeah, no, and I get you. And Rachel, going back to Marjorie, yeah, no, she wasn't canceled by the right because the right is in some ways insane and they support, the extreme viewpoints of people like Marjorie. But she definitely faced backlash, and somebody whispered something in her ear because she did issue some kind of apology. And I don't think it's necessary for us to find that the whole world comes together and unanimously agrees who should be canceled, as much as I'm just making the point that there is this opportunity now for people like Andrew in his bedroom or in his RV or anybody that can open a Twitter account or Facebook to go online and have something to say. And we are seeing changes happening in corporations where we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity in a way that we haven't talked about in years. And a lot of that would not have happened had we relied simply on the power structure itself to correct itself. So I guess that's where Andrew, Dan wants there to be some rules. He keeps talking about, asking these questions. When did you say it? Did you apologize? What other body of work? Well, it's not that neat. We can't package it that way.
Well, the rule should be the golden rule, right? Just, don't cancel onto others as you would not cancel onto yourself.
I like that.
Yeah. And
I like that.
I think, to me, too, one issue in terms of progressives who engage in cancel culture, to me, a big issue is, are you kicking up? Or are you punching up? Or are you kicking down? Right? I think some of the examples we gave, we can all agree on. With the Me Too movement, Harvey Weinstein, easy, right? He was sexually assaulting people. There were numerous witnesses. Of course, he ends up being convicted. But then you have, of course, Al Franken, who was a senator. It appears pretty clearly now, and many of the senators who pushed him out, forced him to resign, agree that probably some of the allegations against him were politically motivated and that he should not have lost his Senate seat. And in the process, we lost a very progressive senator. I think when you talk about due process, you got to look at the institutions that end up firing people or getting rid of people, right? So especially me, I was a labor lawyer for 26 years. I think everyone should have just cause for discharge. I don't think someone should be fired as a professor because a bunch of students don't like an argument someone makes in good faith, right? But they find it offensive in some way.
Well, let me ask you this, Dan. Hold on a second, Dan. But do you agree that those students' voices and complaints about that professor deserve to be heard? And perhaps that professor who has, been able to operate with impunity for decades because he has a tenured position and he was off limits should be investigated, because there are lots of those professors that you're talking about, not you, I'm sure, but who shouldn't be in those jobs, who got there not because of their scholarly work, but because of the old boys network and because of relationships that weren't afforded to folks that look like me, folks that look like Rachel, because, we're women and I'm a woman of color. So, I say bravo to those students that caused those universities to look at those professors' records in ways that they haven't been willing to do so.
Again, depending on the allegation, obviously, if there's claims of sexual harassment or racial harassment, obviously. But then you have, again, this professor over the summer who allegedly people thought that she fell asleep during a Zoom call about racial diversity, and students said she'd be fired because she fell asleep during a Zoom call, which all of us have at least been tempted to do. That is of concern, right? The other thing I want to point out, and I know this from, again, being a union guy, but also being in academia, the idea of tenures leaving, it's going away. It's the way of the dodo. Many professors are adjuncts, okay, who have no job security, who are paid poverty wages. Literally, you have professors living out of cars, okay? Getting someone like that fired, for saying something in a discourse that is reasonable, but that people disagree with and think, again, is somehow offensive. To me, that's troubling, and that is kicking down. It's not punching up.
Okay, so I'm going to ask all of you, help me out, because I'm here advocating for that little guy that has 30 followers on Twitter and who, otherwise nobody cares about, and now they get to talk. Is there a happy medium, Rachel? And is there a way for that voice to have, protection, to be a part of this public discourse, and without the overcorrection of the professor living in the car that Dan is worried about? I don't want that guy, on the unemployment rolls either. So where's the happy medium?
The happy medium actually lies in the responsibility of these gatekeepers, right? Because you don't get David Shore fired, or you don't get Alexi McCannon, not getting this incredible, what an incredible achievement for a woman of color to be at that age put as editor of Teen Vogue. You wouldn't see those things if the gatekeepers, the deciders, could understand nuance a little better too, right? So it is good that we have these outlets for people to express outrage, but there's always going to be a small percentage of people who are very strident on the far right or the far left about what, policing other people's behavior, right? And that really comes down to creating a culture in each company and in each atmosphere that can see and appreciate nuance, that can understand, okay, maybe they're gonna rail against Alexi McCannon's tweet from when she was 18 for a couple of weeks, and then that it will pass, right? But it's the overreaction of these companies, of these society, these HR departments who don't want to deal with any controversy that creates the excesses, and we really can't. There's no uniform way to get them to stop doing that except for to suggest to them, don't overemphasize the social media universe.
All right, Andrew, where's your happy medium?
I agree with Rachel on that. I think that's a big part of it. I'd say two additions to that. One would be, I think, just a very good procedural mechanism we could put in place, which might have a cooling effect on this that would still allow for people to have their discontent come to the fore as they should, but at the same time, not necessarily crescendo into mob action, would be for employers to generally just have a policy in place of, we're not going to fire anybody until 2 weeks after the public broil has taken place. That there's going to be this, we're all going to express our discontent. We're going to give them 2 weeks, and then we're going to make a decision. That way they're able to do it after everybody's had their voice put in and they've had their input, but without having pressure to just do whatever everybody wants on a Twitter mob. The other thing I'd say is that I think that while everybody needs to have, while the gatekeepers very much need to have that appreciation for nuance that Rachel gets into, I think when Areva, you have made the good point of people that are not enfranchised into the system being able to put their voices forward, and I think that's very important. So let me talk to the people who are not in that category but are privileged and bored. We, people who are enfranchised into the system that are privileged and bored, need to turn to our better instincts in terms of when we want to throw rocks at people. Are we doing this because this is truly a monster that needs to be taken down? Are we doing this because it's fun to be righteous? Are we doing this because this is something that really needs to be stopped? Or am I just bored and I want to get likes on Twitter? So I think on our end, we need to also be looking towards our motivation for these things, and whether it's truly a good one or something else.
And clearly they're provocateurs, right? People who just take to social media.
Yes.
As you just said, they want to grow their following. They want to go viral, right? They come up with something, pour ice water over your heads, walk on hot coals, do any number of things. And the sole purpose is not to make some kind of political statement or a statement about, the social good, but it's just simply to be seen. They're thirsty, as we call them. They're looking for attention in any way that they can get it.
Oh, absolutely. And I find it very odd because I've known some of these provocateurs, and they're always stunned when they get canceled. And I'm like, you are a provocateur. You are eventually going to provoke someone. It is not surprising if your goal is to use chaos and anger as a propulsive element for your career, that eventually you're going to blow up on the launch pad. So that's a wonderful point to make.
Yeah. And Dan, so I'll ask you, I'm sitting here thinking about your example of Al Franken. And yeah, some people would say he shouldn't have lost his Tennessee, but still, Al Franken's a white man. He has a podcast. I see him on the news pretty much, weekly. He doesn't seem to be living out of his car or going through, really terribly hard times. So I maybe it was overcorrection with Al, but I'd say if we got Harvey, we got a whole Me Too movement. If Al was, a consequence of that, and that shouldn't have happened. I don't know. I can't get all, worked up about Al Franken in that regard. But you did write this book. So tell us, what do you hope to accomplish in terms of this book?
Well, I think what I am trying to talk to progressive people to that's why the book is titled the way it is. I'm not trying to talk to, right-wing people who have their own cancel culture and all that. And what I'm trying to say is, look, we have to think when we do anything, first of all, those of us interested in social change and social justice, the first thing you got to ask yourself when you engage in something, in an action, is it really reasonably calculated to lead to social change, right? And I think, as Andrew was saying, when really, if you look at yourself and what you are doing or preparing to do, is if it's more about virtue signaling or getting attention for yourself to the detriment of someone. And again, usually I'm worried about the little guy, and many times it's someone who's also involved in the social justice movement. And you're trying to get them canceled because, again, you have different outlooks on different things within the progressive movement. I would say people need to step back and really think of whether that makes sense. Or frankly, especially if you know the person, could I not call the person up on the phone and say, I didn't like that tweet? Can we talk about it? You know, the idea that you shoot now and ask questions later is troubling. And the other thing, and I don't really get into this in the book, but what occurs to me in our discussion today, I do find it deeply troubling that people can do this anonymously, right? That they can get someone fired and there's no risk to themselves because they're doing this anonymously. And I don't think that's fair play. Again, I don't know if we should regulate that, but I certainly think if you, again, are a socially justice-minded person, you shouldn't be going out trying to get people fired anonymously and again, not take a risk yourself that people may call you out for trying to do that, right? I mean, there has to be a little fair play. And again, I would just like to see people have compassion for each other. And that's important. And I think people have to have a chance of redemption. If you make a mistake, an honest mistake, to have a chance of forgiveness and redemption. And I don't see that a lot in the cancel culture.
And Rachel, I'll ask you, Al Franken aside, are there others on the left in particular that you think have been wrongfully canceled? Because I started the conversation with Andrew this morning talking about Cat Williams, who did this podcast where he says, you know, he can't think of anybody that's been canceled that shouldn't have been canceled. Can you think of somebody that has been permanently canceled? Not that it's had a difficult time, because you know, if you're in the media, that's you, that's me, that's everyone on this program this morning, you are going to get attacked for something that you say. You know, we have all been, and I started by saying witch, but I really meant, you know, the B word. I've been called bitch. I've been called dumb. I'm like, oh my God, is that me? You know, I have to look in the mirror. Like, oh, that doesn't sound like me. But so that's going to happen if you have an opinion and if you have the privilege and opportunity to put your opinion out there. But can you really think of someone, you know, that has really suffered long-term consequences that really did deserve it?
I mean, it depends, right? I mean, consequences are relative, right? So to us, you know, the fact that Kathy Griffin, in small part thanks to Bill Maher, managed to eventually survive what happened to her, right? David Shore now has a job and good for the company that works in Democratic politics that picked him up. Alexi McCannon is so talented. I'm sure she'll land on her feet. I'm not sure where she's landed right now. So when you say permanent consequences, like, okay, that's a smaller net, but those are not insufficient, you know, they're not small consequences. Like take Michelle Wolf. She was a comedian that started the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Right. She did absolutely nothing more controversial than Stephen Colbert did in his legendary appearance. I mean, I thought the joke was funny, in fact, but I have a really robust sense of humor. And you know, her career was permanently hurt. I mean, definitely it was hurt by having people overreact to a joke about eyeshadow. You know, the White House press secretary, because it was mean to the press secretary. So I think like our ability to point to somebody who was permanently cast out into, you know, the bowels of the world is probably the wrong frame. If your professional reputation has been hurt, your earnings potential, I mean, you know, trust me, as somebody who knows about that, it's painful. Right.
No. And I don't want to minimize the pain. And obviously there are people, and Michelle, that's a great example of someone, I loved her. I loved her comedy. And I hope that she, you know, is somewhere working on some big, fabulous project that we're going to learn about. So clearly there are people whose careers have suffered as a result. But I guess I'm trying to balance, again, individuals like Michelle, like, you know, Senator Franken, against the greater good that's happening.
And you're right. I mean, because if we were having a conversation about accountability culture, then we would be talking about how incredibly wonderful these changes have been for society, right? I mean, like when I went to a graduate school, I dealt with implicit and veiled sexism, not explicit and loud sexism like you saw on Mad Men. Those are products of accountability culture. Accountability culture is not the same thing as cancel culture, and we would probably be well served to start making those distinctions when we're talking about it.
Yeah, and I think we should make the distinction. I think they get conflated. I think,
Right.
For a lot of people now, accountability culture, consequence culture gets conflated with cancel culture, and it's hard to separate them. We do have this little, phenomenon called the hashtag that's able to unite all of these people together, and some of them aren't, as Daniel has pointed out in his book, oftentimes folks who you think are aligned are actually, infighting. I saw there's a commentator, I won't name his name, on MSNBC. He's African American, and a white person on Twitter says, I'm noticing that we're the only people repeating, what he's saying or retweeting him. It looks like the black liberals, progressives, etc., don't find this guy to be very, on point. He's, they don't agree with his opinion. So, even within the left, we're not a monolithic group, right? We have our own infighting that happens. And Dan says we should be nicer to each other.
Can't go wrong with being nice to people. And you can never go wrong. I think it was Dan or Andrew who said, a cooling off period is sometimes warranted, right? Just because something kicks up a lot of sand doesn't mean it really is something that needs a reaction or a heavy-handed reaction. So,
and we have seen examples of people who've been able to issue an apology and who have been able to move forward. I mean, so there are those examples as well. I know, Dan, you said in the case of the 84-year-old woman that she issued an apology for her, the meme that she posted, but it wasn't considered, sincere and authentic apology, so it wasn't accepted. But I think there are examples of folks who have apologized, and Jeffrey Toobin now on CNN, he issued an apology. He's back on the air.
And CNN had to let him on the air, right? So that's what I was saying. It's so important the gatekeepers, the deciders, the HR departments, the executives make that decision and say, okay, is Jeffrey Toobin really irredeemable because he thought his Zoom camera was off and did something that, people do when they're alone? No. Okay. So I'm putting him back on the air, and it just takes that. David Shore got hired by another excellent firm that was like, dude, you're one of the most talented data scientists in the country. Why would, all he did was post a research study that, didn't have a narrative that people liked. It wasn't, he certainly didn't do it anything that was racist in any way. So, I do think it is about those gatekeepers saying, look, enough's enough, and the excesses do get sorted out, and then the culture overall is able to change, and it needs to change because places of graduate education, not undergrad, but at the graduate level and above, medical schools, and I'm sure even still law schools, do have toxic cultures that need bottom-up pressure to change.
Yeah. That's a great way to end this segment, Rach. I love that. Yeah, you threw us in there too. Law schools, definitely. I'm sure Dan would agree. Law schools are not immune. And I don't know. I'm not a big fan of ruining anyone's career. Obviously, people work hard. They put in a lot of hours, time. And if you've dedicated your life to social justice causes and you make, a mistake, clearly you should not, we shouldn't wipe away your decades of good work because of one mistake. Because it's not about perfection, because none of us would pass the perfection test, right? We all make mistakes. And if you're a talker, if you're a writer, if you're a thinker, you are going to make mistakes. You are going to mess something up. You're going to take a position that you're going to wake up the next day and say, oh my God, that was pretty stupid that I said that. And you're going to regret it. And it shouldn't be that your entire career is harmed or ruined just because of that. But on the other hand, I gotta tell you guys, I'm super excited that everyday people are now able to expose things, whether it's sexual harassment, racial harassment, gender discrimination, age discrimination, discrimination against, the LGBT community that otherwise, just would go unchecked. So I think we can agree that accountability is what we're all in favor of. So I want to thank all of you. Really great conversation, great opinions.
Thank you.
Rachel, keep enlightening us on the political front. Andrew, keep making us laugh, and Dan, keep the progressives in check and make them be nicer to each other. So we have more in
Wonderful.
common than not. So again, Dan's book is Cancel This Book: The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture. Check it out. Who all of you out there that consider yourselves progressive, because it's a great book. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, what a interesting and fun conversation with my guests this morning. I want to thank them again, and thanks to all of you for your comments and your questions. Yeah, there is a raging debate happening right now in this country, and there's probably no one right or wrong answer about this quote unquote cancel culture. As I just stated, I don't like mobs, and I don't, like folks trying to take other folks down just for sport or just, to build their own social media presence or get likes on social media. That is just stupid. It's wrong. It's not the way we should be behaving as adults. That's not the purpose and goal of social media. And no, we don't have to be perfect. We all going to make mistakes, and we should be able to speak our minds, make a mistake, apologize for it, and let our body of work should speak for us. And when we're judging someone, not just on one statement. And we saw a perfect example of this, Joe Biden. He was just giving a press conference after his big tour abroad, his big trip, and he snapped at the CNN reporter. And he didn't dig his heels in and to try to defend his conduct. He immediately apologized to her. And okay, fine. He was a little testy at the moment. He snapped at her. He made a mistake. Joe didn't need to be canceled because we know Joe is incredibly polite as it relates to pretty much everyone that we see in the public eye and the media. And he treats people with civility, and he is courteous to folks. So that's a perfect example of make a mistake, say you're sorry, move on. So that's going to be the lesson for today. Some words to live by before I get out. And I think you heard it said earlier on the show, accountability ain't cancellation. Cancel culture is frequently invoked by those folks who don't want to be held accountable for their words and their actions. We know in this country, you can pretty much say whatever it is you want within the bounds of the law and the First Amendment. You just have to be prepared to live with the consequences. And the reality is millions of people are awakening and finding their voices. And in doing so, they are pushing back on racist, sexist, homophobic, and oftentimes offensive rhetoric that folks of influence and positions of power have been able to use with impunity. Now, is this really cancel culture, or is this just whining by folks who are being called on the carpet? Vile words and sentiments that have been used to intimidate and marginalize groups of people must be taken seriously, whether by an institution, place of employment, or in personal relationships. And sorry, I'm just sorry, but dealing with the consequences of your negative actions never comes at the right time. And I just want to remind you, don't lose sight of this fact that we live in the most liberal democracy in the world with some of the most robust speech protections. And megastar Kevin Hart, he has continued to rack up film and TV credits and Netflix specials despite being quote unquote canceled. And likewise, conservatives continue to enjoy their own robust parallel media ecosystem from which, they're using to lob missiles at liberals, and, they wear being canceled as a badge of honor as they engage in efforts themselves to cancel pretty much anyone that speaks the truth in this country. They have no shortage of ways to have their voices heard. So I'll end by saying, in the words of Cat Williams, what the F are we talking about? I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there, and remember, we are all in this together.